Hello there guys. Today I have a first for my channel as I'm bringing you a full build of a kit before it is available in the shops. Luke at Revell has very kindly sent me this test shot of their new 1/72nd scale F-35A, and so I thought I would give it a build and a paint so you can see what it's like. Now this is the final plastic, but it's been sent to me before all those other manufacturing processes like printing the box art and the decals and so on have been completed. So I've got the plastic like this, I've got digital instructions, I don't have a box but it will look like this, and although the decals weren't printed at the time I received the plastic, they arrived by the time I came to that stage. Now this is a completely new tooling of the F-35A. Revell did release an F-35A in this scale previously, back in 2020, but I believe that was based on a 2013 Italeri tooling. This however is a completely new tool, as I say. So let's take a quick look at the instructions and then we will go to the build sequence. This is Revell's standard instruction format, which tends to be printed in full colour. The skill level 4 there, I think, refers more than anything else to the number of parts that a kit has, rather than any perceived difficulty. And you can see the copyright date down there of 2025. We've got the usual advice, instructions and safety warnings. And then Revell's standard way of representing colours, with the references there referring to their own line of paints. And Revell instructions do seem to love a good paint mix. They always seem to want you to combine one thing or another. Personally, I don't use Revell paints anyway, so I only use this really as a very rough guide. One thing that is quite helpful though is that the letters here, when they appear in the instructions, appear in the colour of the paint, so you don't have to keep flicking back to see what colour B is or what colour D is and so on. We have a sprue map here, carrying on down the pages. One sprue just for ordnance, and we do get quite a lot of that, and of course some clear parts. Unusually for an aircraft, we don't start in the cockpit, but instead with the weapons bay. The majority of that is all detailed on a single part, as you'll see when we build it, but there are a few extra pieces to add there. Then we move down to the air intakes, and one thing I really like about this kit is you get lots of options. So we've got the stealth mode clean configuration with no external weapons, although of course there may still be some in that internal weapons bay. Air-to-air mode with some simple aim 9s on the wingtips, and beast mode with 6 weapons pylons, plus the internal capacity. And that's not quite the full story, as you'll see later, because we do get the option to have different weapons on those 6 pylons. Down in step 11 we have to drill some holes for the various pylons, and of course that depends on the mode you're going to have. So of course beast mode option C requires the most holes to be drilled. One option that I thought wasn't very clear here, and could have been made a lot more clear, I had to do a bit of research to work this one out, is these holes in the centre here for these Lundberg lenses. I think that's how you pronounce it. It does say here they're used during peacetime to make the F-35A more visible to radar. It wasn't always clear to me when they should be included, or if they should always be included but they're simply not used in times of combat. And I think the instructions could have done a better job of making that clear. In the end I didn't drill those holes. That internal weapons bay clips very clearly into the lower fuselage half, as do the air intakes and the undercarriage bays. Then we build the front wheel bay and the cockpit, and that's what I mean about the colours being nice and clear on the instructions. So though you might not be able to tell exactly what colour N is, you can very clearly tell it's some kind of grey colour and distinguish it from the M, which is black. We have another option in step 18, which again is not super well marked, which is the holes for the drag chute. I believe that is only currently being used by the Norwegian Air Force. And again we've got some more holes for those peacetime Lundberg lenses. Top and bottom fuselage going together in step 19, And here is the information in step 20 and 21, which I could have done with before I drill those holes, which is those lenses as separate pieces. We have the engine in step 22 with a nice option there of that A17 blanking plate in red. So that's quite a nice little touch. And then some control surfaces which are different depending on whether the aircraft is landed or in flight. Then for the landed version only, of course, we have the undercarriage. For the front wheel bay door we only get one piece and we have to cut that in two if we want it to be open, which I thought was an interesting decision. More parts being fitted here. Weapon bay doors being fitted here. And the closed version of the same. And then the final details. And here are the weapon loadout options which I talked about earlier. So anything from 2 Sidewinders through 4 AIM 120s, all the way up to 6 either Paveways or JDAM bombs. Now initially when I read this table I was reading it in rows, so I assumed that each row was a different option. But looking at some of the reference photos, it does seem that you can combine things on different pylons. So for example, I could have 2 Sidewinders on the outer pylons and still have the JDAMs or the Paveways in the inner 2 pylons, and of course in the internal weapons bay. But what I actually missed until fairly late on in the build process is I could have 2 Sidewinders, 2 Paveways or JDAMs on each wing, 2 Paveway or JDAMs in the centre, and still have 2 AIM 120s in the centre as well with those JDAMs. I think that's correct. It certainly looks like that from the reference photo that I'm seeing. So in that case you could have a total of 10 individual bombs or missiles on a single aircraft. 3 in each wing and 4 in the centre. In step 54 we add those pylons, and I think I found a small mistake in this step, but I'll talk about that more during the build. Building up our relevant weapons. And then here right towards the end we finally build the seat and the pilot figure, along with the instrument panel, although it's not really an instrument panel so much as a screen. A few final steps including the optional retractable boarding ladder, and we are good to go. And just one note here, actually in step 72 we get the option to add these FOD barriers to the air intakes and to the engine. So that's quite a nice detail that I don't see in a lot of kits. In terms of colour schemes, our first one is the 48th Fighter Wing at RAF Lakenheath in the UK, not too far from here actually. F-35 schemes don't tend to vary that much, but you can see we've got a number of decals and we have some decals there for the weaponry, as well as a painting guide. We've got optional crew names on the nose door for this one. We then have option B, which is a German F-35A. Again, very low visibility colour scheme, with a few small insignia on the tail and near the cockpit. And the final option for this boxing is this Royal Netherlands Air Force version, Vaucluse Air Base 313 Squadron. And that has this low visibility 3 shades of grey roundel there. So enough about the instructions, and let's start with the build. Initially at least I followed the instruction booklet, so I started with that weapons bay. This is the single piece here, which as you can see has quite a lot of detail on it, especially for a 1/72 scale kit. The reference photos make it a bit difficult to see the weapons bay, so it would have been nice if perhaps the instructions had a bit more detail about some of the interior colours in here. We've got a few extra parts here to add detail that couldn't be moulded into the base piece, and of course the pipes, which are very prominent in any of the reference photos. Then it was time to drill the holes in the wings that I talked about earlier, and because I was going for full-on beast mode, every single hole needed drilling. I'm just resting the wing here on some XPS foam because it won't lay flat on the desk and I don't want to bend it when I drill the hole through it. Our fully detailed weapons bay can then just drop into that fuselage half, nice and snugly. I think that looks great from the outside. I didn't glue it into place at this stage because I wanted to make it easier to paint, and because the inside of the lower fuselage would need painting in a couple of areas too, where it will be visible. Here's the backing for the undercarriage bays. No separate parts required there, just a slot for the undercarriage itself. And they will just snap in on top of and to the side of the weapons bay. The floor of the cockpit is the same piece as the roof of the nose gear bay. It's detailed on both sides, although strangely the top side is lost when the cockpit goes on. And we just have this simple box here for the nose gear. Although the back and forth position of this cockpit on this piece here was quite clear, there wasn't anything to stop it sliding side to side, so I left it separate initially and then put it into place once I had the fuselage halves ready so they would hold it in the right position. Now I couldn't put the fuselage halves together at this stage because I hadn't done any painting yet, but I was keen to get some sub-assemblies built, so I moved on to the weapons pylons. I think here there's a small mistake in the instructions. If we look at the left hand side of the image here, which is the port wing, we see that part E91 is towards the outside of the wing and E89 is towards the inner. On the right hand side of the image, the starboard wing, that is the other way around. E91 is closer to the fuselage. Now it would make sense that the pieces were put on symmetrically, and I believe the right hand side there, the starboard wing, is the correct way of doing it. You can see here I've frozen the video. This is the port wing, part E91, and you can see that the pins on that don't match the location of the holes. They're slightly further apart than the holes in the wing, and I have drilled those holes in the right place. However, those pins do perfectly match the inner pylon holes, like so. So I think it's just a simple case of the two are the wrong way around. No big deal, the pylons appear to be the same anyway, and certainly they can carry the same weapons. Talking of weapons, I went for a full loadout of JDAMs. I built up 6 of these, although I noticed later on when I'd painted them that I only had 4 yellow stripe decals to go on them, so I'm not entirely convinced now that 6 JDAMs is a correct, valid loadout. I then moved on to the cockpit seat, which is a small number of pieces, and then our pilot. The pose of this pilot might look slightly odd, but actually his hands are positioned there for the 2 control levers on either side of the cockpit. The pilot's separately moulded head is then added, and then it's time to do some painting. The weapons bay, the undercarriage bays and the undercarriage themselves are all white. To get some pre-shading on that, I gave everything a coat of primer, then a coat of XF1 black from Tamiya, and then finally the XF2 white. And you can tell there, just by having that black base coat and varying the intensity of the white, you get quite a lot of sort of shading and variation that looks a bit like grime. Using various references, I then picked out some colours in that weapons bay using Vallejo model colour. There is actually quite a lot of colour in here, with some red and yellow on the pipes, as well as some black and some chrome. And I think that looks really good overall. Remember, this is 1/72nd scale, so I think that's a really good amount of detail to cram into such a small space. Now, to be honest with you, for the cockpit colour I simply mixed up a medium to dark grey colour, not really matching it against any kind of references. That enabled me to put the nose gear bay / cockpit floor into place. The instructions do tell you to add a few grams of weight here to the nose. I completely forgot to do that. Touch wood, I've had no problem so far, but you should probably do it. The weapons and wheel bays could then be glued into place. And before I could close the fuselage halves, I needed to add the air intakes. These were the only parts of the kit that I found slightly tricky to fit. The diagonal edge on the fuselage there wasn't really sharp enough to give me a good sort of locking position for the air intake piece. And as a result, I wasn't quite sure if I had it in the right position. It's one of those situations where you need to close the fuselage halves straight after to make sure everything's lined up, but if you do that, you can't get your fingers or your tweezers in to squeeze the joint closed. And you can see there that left me with a slight gap underneath the cockpit. With our pylons and our control surfaces in position, I could mask off the weapon bays ready for the overall painting. Rather handily, we get separate weapon bay doors for open and closed, so I could use the closed doors here as a perfectly fitting mask to protect that paintwork. We don't get such a thing for the wheel wells, so I use some blue tack. This was my initial painting, a coat of Tamiya grey primer followed by some panel line shading in XF1 black. Now, F-35 paint colours can be a bit confusing, at least to me. F-35s do tend to appear very differently in different lighting conditions, and I believe that newer F-35s also have a slightly lighter grey colour compared to the older ones. Now, it's my understanding that the grey colour that these aircraft are painted in is called camouflage grey, which is FX36170, and that they have a coating applied on top of that grey called Havglass, which reduces the radar visibility of the aircraft. My understanding is that Havglass is a coating, not a normal coloured paint itself, and so it's applied over the aircraft's standard paintwork. To add to the confusion, model paint manufacturers sometimes seem to use the FS number, the term camouflage grey and Havglass interchangeably. So for example, the paint that I went for in the end was AK Real Colours, which calls itself Havglass Grey FS36170. Other paint manufacturers like Mr. Paint, I believe, has two separate paints, one for the grey and one for the Havglass special coating. Either way, I painted my F-35 in the AK Real Colours colour and it looked like this. To be honest, this took me by surprise. I thought the grey was a lot lighter than I expected, and it seemed to be lighter than the reference colours too. So what I did is take this AK Real Colours as the base coat for the lighter grey that we can see on the paint scheme, for example the leading edges and so on. I masked those off, and then I painted the whole aircraft again in this same Havglass, but with a tiny amount of black mixed in. And that gave me this result, which I personally prefer. Now, the F-35 is quite famous for the patterns on the upper surfaces, which are radar absorbent tape around the edges of access panels and similar. However, if we look at more recent F-35s, like this one here from RAF Lakenheath, you can see that those edges are much less prominent than in the older ones. Revell don't give us any decals for those seams, and I didn't see the need to mask off and paint them. So on the fairly small decal sheet we have a few common stencils and markings. We have decals for the weaponry, and of course we have the scheme specific decals as well. I gave the aircraft a coat of VMS semi-gloss varnish because I thought that was the finish that I would want in the end, and because it also provides a smoother finish for the decals. These decals were really thin and they went down very well, adapting nicely to the surface with a bit of Tamiya mark fit. There are a surprising number of decals, particularly the stencils. And it took me about 2 evenings to get them all down. As mentioned, we also have decals for the weapons. With the decals down, I wasn't super happy with this semi-gloss finish that the aircraft had, although having said that it looks quite nice on video, but in real life it looked a bit too shiny and a little bit toy-like, so I did decide to go with a matte coat of VMS varnish, even though of course we do get that slight glint from the real F-35s. I think in reality maybe a mix of the matte and the semi-gloss to bring it a bit further towards matte without being fully matte might have been the best option. Then of course there were just a few extra details: landing gear bay doors, weapons bay doors. I went for the pilot in the cockpit but with the canopy closed. And it's worth noting here that the only parts I've got which are not the final parts is the transparencies. I believe the final canopy will have a very slight yellow tint, but at the time of sending the kit to me they hadn't decided the extent of that, which is why the part I've got is perfectly clear. Of course I could airbrush some clear yellow onto this myself, but I'm perfectly happy with it being clear. And with that done, my F-35A Beast Mode is complete. So there we go guys, that was my full review and build of the brand new 2025 tooling Revell 1/72 scale F-35A. This kit should be available in the shops in about a month, so March 2025, and at the moment I see it on pre-order for about £27 British. I thought this was a really enjoyable build. It was quite a straightforward build, no major issues whatsoever. Parts went together well, and parts like the horizontal and vertical stabilizers went in nice and snugly. There was no sort of wobble room or anything, so you know you're getting them at exactly the right angle. Detail was really good, especially in that weapons bay, and there was a really nice selection of weaponry as well. I think this is probably better than any other kit in this scale. Looking at the instructions for the other 1/72 scale F-35s, I think a lot of them do include weaponry, but they don't seem to have quite as many options as this kit. Talking of options, you can build this in landed or flying configurations. You can have the canopy open or closed, you can have the option of the crew ladder, and you've got, for a landed aircraft, those blanking panels for the air intake and the exhaust. In terms of room for improvement, maybe a little bit more detail in the instructions might have been helpful. For example, exactly when and why to use those lens parts, or the parachute housing part. And I think personally I would have liked to have a detailed colour guide for the weapons bay too, rather than just saying that it's all painted white. But overall, this is a really enjoyable build. I'm really happy with my final model, and I think it looks great in this fully loaded beast mode. I would like to say thank you to all of you for watching. Thank you again to Luke from Revell for sending me this early release of the kit. And of course, special thanks to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. I've been getting a bit more modelling done recently, so I will have another video for you soon. But until then, thank you again for watching, and have fun modelling.